Hello, in this discussion we are going to examine nukes, experience, and conflict based on Michael Horowitz's article from 2009. So at this point in the semester we should be quite familiar with the structure and function of academic articles. It is imperative that you be able to identify the key components as outlined in the article review assignments. Therefore, from this point forward, we are only going to identify the key ideas and help with interpreting results, as the results sections do remain difficult to penetrate and difficult to engage. This question in this paper examines essentially what happens with nuclear possession. So nuclear weapons are obviously both advanced weapons that require an incredible amount of scientific energy to develop, but they are also a weapon that you have to learn how to handle. And this is more than just avoiding accidents or accidentally dropping nuclear weapons, say on your own country or in the ocean south of Spain or in the Mediterranean south of Spain, both of which the United States has accidentally done, that there's a change in perception about how nuclear weapons, once you've had them, how you function. Now, one thing I like about this article is how well it sets up the literature review based on clustering. So as you move through each paragraph in the literature review and largely the theory, you see a huge body of work that this piece builds on as it relates to a specific idea or area of the literature. So for example, it's changes in the nature of warfare. There's a whole bunch of citations. So we know that there's evidence to suggest that nuclear weapons change the nature of warfare, but then the immediate next paragraph, we're not exactly sure how. Right? There is disagreement about why sometimes deterrence fails. Right? Then there's a break in the literature and says, okay, so we know that nuclear weapons may change these dynamics. How? And this is where I think this article's innovation comes. It argues that there's learning processes in international relations. So looking at the literature, not dealing with nuclear politics in any way or nuclear weapons, but looking at a broader area, a broader focus, says learning occurs. And how learning occurs influences the perception of a state's security environment. So by putting these two ideas together, nuclear weapons change the nature of the dynamic, learning processes occur in the security field, we end up generating the theory and the argument that this paper articulates. So this is one way to think about your theoretical critiques, is being able to say, here's what we know so far. How do I extend what we know, or how do I learn more about what I know? If we can learn more and be able to identify more with a different theory or different argument, or not different cases, because that's basically just better data, which is not acceptable for theoretical critiques, that's how you then expand research. Another way to think about this is, how do I answer the next question? Or what is the next question? If we think about the theory, this breaks down pretty quickly in terms of if a state has weapons for a long time, it increases their confidence. And obviously nuclear weapons, there increases the costs, which we'll come back to in other sections, costs of conflict. Annihilation, total war, total annihilation is a consequence of nuclear weapons. That means that the maximum you can escalate is total annihilation. That's very distinct from conventional conflicts between states who are non-nuclear powers. What is the worst possible outcome in those conflicts? Well, then it depends on the balance of power, topography, and tactics and use. That's not the case with nuclear weapons, right? You can just skip immediate to total global annihilation, and that's what changes. And so what Horowitz will argue is that leveraging your nuclear weapon, you learn how to handle it. You start to learn when it can be used, when is it appropriate, even just to make sure it's functional. And adversaries also learn what the state that possesses it is likely to do. Right? So this would be the question that we have now, would be to think through, how do we think through North Korea? So North Korea has a nuclear weapon, 15 years or so, 18 years, and how have they behaved with it? Well, there's a lot of saber rattling. There's not a lot of nuking. They haven't used a nuclear weapon, but there have been nuclear confrontations, military confrontations with South Korea, whether it's torpedoing a ship or artillery barrages on certain types of islands, very provocative missile satellite launches, ballistic missile testing, firing missiles over Japan. There's all kinds of activities. But the fact that they've had a nuke for this long and haven't changed or escalated in certain ways, that tells us something. And so what this paper argues is that the learning process means that as states learn more about their own arsenal and other states learn about their behavior, that you're less likely to reciprocate a militarized interstate dispute with someone the longer that someone's had weapons. Or another way to think about that, in the way it's phrased in the hypothesis, newer nuclear states reciprocate disputes more often than older nuclear states. And it goes for initiators and for defenders. So remember, this is a dyadic structure. So when we think about dyads, we don't really care about just North Korea's behavior by itself, right, in isolation, because remember, this theory is the other side has to be learning how you behave with a nuclear weapon. So in the dyadic structure, it would be a dyad of North Korea and Japan, or North Korea and South Korea. So it matters what they're learning, because remember, South Korea and Japan, they may learn something different. They may interpret the behavior of North Korea differently than the other. And so it's a dyadic structure. So the unit of analysis is, it would be like North Korea, Japan, 1980. North Korea, Japan, 1981. North Korea, Japan, 1982. So can't remember its directed dyad. It almost have to be directed dyad because defender initiator. And so you have directed dyad year as the unit of analysis. And what that tells us is it doesn't matter who's engaged in these activities. Okay, the rest of the research design we should be quite familiar with. You know how to identify your key explanatory variables. Obviously, the dependent variable is militarized interstate disputes. You know how to define those terms and pull out the substantive effects. So what I'm going to do is just walk through a little bit of the main results, because there is a little bit of confusion in it when we first read through it. So what we read in these first 4 key variables is side A, side B, both are they nuclear or not, and then the nuclear age. And what we show here is, remember that these are directed. So side A is the challenger in a particular event. Side B is the defender. And what you see is that if side A is the challenger, nuclear weapons have no effect. The result's statistically insignificant. But if B is the defender, they're actually more likely to reciprocate. So at first it's like, oh, that's kind of counter to what we're looking for. But remember, we're looking really for age. Okay, so, and as is discussed in the article, if you read about these 2 results for side A and side B, basically the author says we need more investigation. This is an unanswered question about why we see this pattern, though it does stylistically fit with what we know about nuclear weapons. Side A, nuclear age, and side B, nuclear age, are both negative and both statistically significant in all 3 models. So what does that tell us? That tells us that as age goes up, so as you've had nuclear weapons longer, the likelihood that you engage in a military interstate dispute goes down for both defenders and challengers. Right? The key variable in this is actually side B, nuclear age. We want to know about the defender's behavior with nuclear weapons. Well, once you start to see that, is basically you see a slow transition towards less conflict. This is substantively captured in Figure 1. What we have in Figure 1 are the predicted probabilities of reciprocating a mid based on years of nuclear weapons. So the predicted probability moving from 50% to 0.5 to 0.1 over years. Now remember that years is a long time period, and so it's in intervals of 20 and 40 and 60 years. So when we think through it, remember obviously 1945 is the start date that we use for nuclear weapons, because that's when they were first detonated and used in combat. And depending on when you become a nuclear power, it obviously moves forward in time. And what we see is both A and B only having nuclear weapons reciprocation goes down if only one side has nuclear weapons. So regardless of kind of where there are different dyadic effects, if both have nuclear weapons, essentially it goes down. Nuclear weapons decrease conflict reciprocation. So that doesn't necessarily mean it decreases conflict. We need to be very careful here. Well, the dependent variable we're talking about is reciprocating a militarized interstate dispute. So somebody starts a dispute and you start it back, or you respond back to it. That's distinct from a nuclear power initiating a MID to achieve a policy goal, which is partly why we look at a couple other articles. So this is one of your discussion questions. If nuclear states learn how to handle weapons, so that's Horowitz's argument, or conflict activity actually declines with nuclear possession, which is Narang's argument, what are the policy implications for states like Iran or North Korea from a U.S. perspective? But remember, these are just two articles. This is not necessarily settled science, and neither is necessarily true, right? It could be, but that's not how science works. We need to have a body of evidence. So I want you to consider that as it relates to the dominant U.S. foreign policy position for the last 50 years, which is that nuclear proliferation is one of the most dangerous world events, and after 1955-56 Atoms for Peace program, it became clear prevention is an activity that the United States funds and conducts internationally. So I want you to juxtapose kind of what the science shows so far with U.S. policy, and recognize from the first week of class that these are just two articles, and we have to kind of judge the veracity of them. So pull other sources, identify other inferences, pull other scholars. Other scholars would have different analysis and different results. What should the United States do for countries like Iran or North Korea? Thanks.